Margaret Whitmore had learned to recognize the sound of hunger long before the war came to Millbrook, Virginia. It was in the hollow scrape of a spoon against an empty bowl, the way children's voices grew thin when they asked for seconds that weren't there. The particular silence that fell over a dinner table when the last of the cornbread disappeared. But the hunger she heard in the autumn of 1863 was different. It came with the shuffle of worn boots on her back porch and the careful, desperate breathing of someone trying not to collapse. The knock was so soft, she almost missed it over the October wind rattling her kitchen windows. Margaret set down the letter she'd been reading for the 100th time. Thomas's last words, written in his careful hand from somewhere near Gettysburg 3 months before he died. And listened. The sound came again, barely more than a whisper against the weathered wood of her door. She had been sitting at her small kitchen table, trying to make sense of the numbers in her ledger book by the flickering light of a single candle. The mathematics of survival had become increasingly complex as the war dragged on. How many eggs could she trade for flour? How much cornmeal would see them through the winter? Whether the threadbare blankets would last another season, or if she would need to unravel her own wedding dress to make new ones. Every calculation seemed to end with the same conclusion. There was never quite enough of anything. If you're enjoying this story and can imagine yourself in Margaret's shoes during these difficult times, please subscribe to our channel and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We love hearing from viewers around the world who connect with these human stories from America's past. She knew better than to answer unexpected visitors after dark. Millbrook sat too close to the shifting battle lines, caught in that uncertain territory where armies moved like weather systems, unpredictable and destructive. Too many desperate men moved through the Virginia countryside like ghosts, some wearing blue, others gray, most wearing whatever they could find to keep the cold and rain from their skin. The stories that came back from other towns spoke of homes ransacked, women terrorized, children left orphaned by men who had forgotten the difference between enemy combatants and innocent civilians. But something in that hesitant knock spoke to the part of her that had spent 2 years learning to stretch a handful of flour into a week's worth of meals for herself and 7-year-old Samuel. It was the sound of someone who understood they were asking for something they had no right to expect, someone who knew they were imposing but had run out of alternatives. Margaret had made that sound herself when she'd knocked on Mrs. Henderson's door last winter to ask if she could trade mending work for a bit of salt pork. Margaret moved to the window and peered through the gap in the curtains her mother had sewn in happier times. A man sat slumped against her porch rail, his head tilted back against the post, as though even the effort of holding it upright had become too much. Even in the dim moonlight, she could see the grey wool of his uniform, torn and stained dark in places she didn't want to think about. A Confederate soldier, perhaps 20 miles from where he should be, if the last news from town was true. Her hand moved instinctively to the letter in her apron pocket, Thomas's letter, with its careful words about duty and honor, and the hope that she would understand why he had to march north with the 14th Virginia Infantry. Thomas, who had worn that same grey wool when he kissed her goodbye in the spring of 1862, his face already grim with the knowledge of what he was walking toward. Thomas, who would never come home to explain why honor mattered more than the life they'd built together in their small house at the edge of Millbrook. The soldier's head lolled forward, and she heard him try to muffle a cough that sounded like it came from somewhere deep and damaged. Margaret had heard that sound before, in the weeks after Samuel's birth, when the fever nearly took him, when she had sat up night after night, listening to her son's labored breathing and bargaining with God for his life. This man was dying, or close enough to it that the distinction hardly mattered. She should have left him there. Every instinct Thomas had taught her about wartime survival, every warning the other women in town had shared over their sewing circles, every story of violence and theft that followed armies like carrion birds, all of it screamed at her to bolt the door and wait for morning. If he died on her porch, she could claim ignorance. If he lived through the night, perhaps he would move on and become someone else's problem. The war had taught everyone to think in such terms, to calculate the cost of compassion and weigh it against the risk of survival. Margaret had watched neighbors she'd known all her life turn suspicious and hard, had seen friendships destroyed by competing needs and limited resources. She had learned to sleep with a loaded pistol under her pillow and to tell Samuel to hide in the root cellar if strangers came calling when she wasn't home. But Margaret had also spent too many nights listening to Samuel cry from hunger, had felt too many mornings when her own empty stomach made her hands shake as she tried to work her small garden. She recognized the particular desperation of someone whose body was consuming itself, and she could not leave another human being to face that alone. Not when she had the power to help, even if it was dangerous, even if it was foolish. She opened the door. The soldier's eyes snapped open at the sound, and his hand moved toward something at his belt before he seemed to remember where he was. His face was gaunt and pale, with the hollow look of someone who had been walking on nothing but will for far too long. Dark hair fell across his forehead, matted with sweat despite the cool night air, and when he tried to speak, his voice came out as barely more than a whisper. "Ma'am, I'm sorry to trouble you. I needed to rest a moment." Margaret studied his face in the moonlight, looking for signs of the violence or madness that the war was said to carve into men. Instead, she saw embarrassment and a kind of careful politeness that reminded her of her younger brother James before he'd marched away to his own death at Antietam. This was someone's son, someone's husband, perhaps, trying to maintain dignity while his body betrayed him. There was something in his eyes, not the flat emptiness she'd seen in other soldiers who'd passed through town, but a kind of weary sadness that spoke of someone who still remembered what he'd lost. "You're hurt," she said, though it was hardly a question. He glanced down at his left side, where his grey jacket hung strangely, as though something underneath wasn't quite right. She caught a glimpse of fabric stained black in the moonlight, the telltale signs of blood that had dried and soaked through multiple layers. It's healing, ma'am. I just need to rest a bit, and then I'll be moving on. I don't want to cause you any trouble." The formal courtesy in his voice struck her as almost heartbreaking. Here was a man who was clearly dying by degrees, who had probably been walking for days or weeks with nothing but determination keeping him upright, and he was worried about inconveniencing her. It reminded her of Thomas, who had always been careful to wipe his boots before entering someone else's home, even when that home belonged to his own wife. "Where are you headed?" "South," he said, which could have meant anywhere from Richmond to the Gulf of Mexico. "Back to my unit, if I can find them." Margaret looked up and down the empty road that ran past her small house. The dirt track had once connected Millbrook to the larger world, bringing traveling merchants and news from distant places. Now it seemed to lead only to uncertainty and loss. Millbrook had never been much more than a crossroads and a handful of families, but the war had made it smaller still. The Hendersons had left for Richmond after their oldest boy died at Bull Run, unable to bear living in the house where they'd raised him. The Carpenters had moved in with relatives in Lynchburg when their farm failed, their fields lying fallow because there were no men left to work them. Most of the young men were gone, and half of those who remained came back, changed in ways that made their families lock doors that had never needed locking before. "What's your name?" she asked. "Private Daniel Hayes, ma'am, 33rd Virginia Infantry." Margaret felt her breath catch. She knew the 33rd. They had been part of the same brigade as Thomas's regiment, at least for a while. The knowledge should have comforted her, this connection between her dead husband and the dying man on her porch, but instead it made everything more complicated. If she helped him, was she honoring Thomas's memory or betraying it? If she turned him away, was she protecting her son or abandoning the values Thomas had died defending? The wind picked up, rattling the bare branches of the oak tree that Thomas had planted the year Samuel was born. It had been just a sapling then, barely taller than Margaret's waist, but Thomas had insisted it would grow strong and provide shade for their children's children. Now it towered over the house, its roots deep and its branches wide, a living monument to his optimism and faith in the future. The irony wasn't lost on her. The tree had survived, while the man who planted it had not. "I can spare some broth," she heard herself say, "and there's clean water for washing." Daniel Hayes blinked up at her as though she had spoken in a foreign language. "Ma'am, I don't have anything to trade." "I'm not asking for trade." She stepped back to let him enter, and he struggled to his feet with obvious pain. As he moved into the lamplight of her kitchen, she could see the extent of his condition more clearly. The wound in his side had bled through multiple layers of bandaging, creating a dark stain that spread across his ribs and down toward his hip. His boots were held together with rope and hope, the leather cracked and separating from the soles. When he removed his cap, she could see that his dark hair was streaked with premature grey that spoke of months or years of stress that no 20-something man should have to carry. But it was his hands that told the real story. They were a working man's hands, scarred and calloused from labor, but also from fighting. There were old cuts across his knuckles, a partially healed burn on his left palm, fingernails broken and blackened from God only knew what kind of work or violence. These were hands that had built things and destroyed them, that had held weapons and tools with equal familiarity. "Sit," she said, indicating the chair beside her small table. "I'll heat some broth." While the pot warmed over her fire, Margaret found herself stealing glances at her unexpected guest. Daniel Hayes sat carefully upright, his hands folded in his lap, his eyes fixed on the worn wooden surface of her table, as though he were afraid to look around and see too much of her private life. There was something almost childlike in his posture, the way he held himself small and still, trying to take up as little space as possible. The kitchen seemed different with him in it, smaller somehow, but also more complete. Margaret realized she had grown accustomed to the echo of her own footsteps, the way her voice sounded when she spoke to Samuel in the empty rooms. Having another adult presence changed the entire atmosphere of the space, made it feel more like a home and less like a shelter, where she and Samuel were simply waiting for whatever came next. "Your husband," Daniel said quietly, noticing Thomas's coat hanging on a peg by the door. The grey wool was faded now, and Margaret had mended the tears that had been in it when the army sent it back to her, along with his other belongings. She had considered giving it away or cutting it up for other uses, but somehow she couldn't bring herself to do it. It was one of the few tangible reminders she had left of the man who had worn it. "Is he—" "Gettysburg," Margaret said. 3 months ago." Daniel's shoulders sagged slightly, and she saw something flicker across his face. Recognition, perhaps, or the particular kind of sorrow that came from hearing about another death in a war that had already claimed too many lives. "I'm sorry, the 14th was— they were good men." Something in his tone made her turn from the stove. "You knew them?" "We fought alongside them at Chancellorsville." "Your husband, was he— what was his name?" "Thomas Whitmore." Daniel's head came up sharply, and for a moment Margaret saw something flicker across his face. Surprise, recognition, something deeper that might have been guilt or sorrow, or both. His eyes widened, and his hands tightened on the edge of the table, as though he needed something solid to hold on to. But before she could ask what had caused such a reaction, Samuel's voice called from the small bedroom they shared. "Mama? Who's there?" "Just someone who needs help, sweetheart. Go back to sleep." But Samuel appeared in the doorway anyway, rubbing his eyes and staring at the strange man in his kitchen. He was small for 7, made smaller by the lean months they'd endured, but he had Thomas's steady gaze and the same stubborn set to his jaw that had made his father impossible to argue with once his mind was made up. His nightshirt was too short for him now. Another reminder of how quickly children grew and how difficult it was to keep up with their needs when resources were scarce. "Are you a soldier?" Samuel asked Daniel directly, with the fearless curiosity that children possessed before the world taught them to be afraid of strangers. "I am. Did you know my papa?" "He was a soldier too, but he died fighting the Yankees." Margaret saw Daniel flinch at the casual way her son spoke of death, the matter-of-fact tone that children developed when loss became ordinary. It was one of the war's cruelest effects, the way it forced children to grow up too quickly, to accept tragedy as normal rather than exceptional. Samuel had been 5 when Thomas left for war, and now at 7 he spoke of death and battle with the same casual familiarity that other children might discuss their favorite games. Daniel looked at Samuel for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice was gentler than it had been before, pitched to the level of someone who understood how to talk to children without talking down to them. "What was your papa like?" Samuel brightened immediately, always eager to talk about the father he barely remembered but held in his imagination like a treasured story. He was tall, and he could fix anything that was broken, and he made the best whistles from willow branches. They sounded just like real birds. He promised to make me a real wooden soldier when he came home, with a sword and everything, but... The boy's voice trailed off, and Margaret felt the familiar tightness in her chest that came whenever Samuel spoke of Thomas, in the present tense, as though death were just another kind of absence that could be remedied with patience and waiting. She had tried to explain death to him in terms a child could understand, but how could you make sense of something that made no sense to adults? "I'm sure he was a fine man," Daniel said quietly, and there was something in his voice, a weight, a knowledge, that made Margaret look at him more closely. Margaret ladled broth into a bowl and set it in front of Daniel, along with the last of the cornbread she'd baked that morning. She watched him struggle with whether to eat quickly or slowly, the eternal dilemma of the truly hungry: devour everything immediately and risk making yourself sick, or make it last as long as possible and savor every bite. In the end, hunger won, and he ate with the focused intensity of someone whose body had learned not to waste energy on anything but survival. The broth was thin, made from bones she'd been boiling for days, stretched with whatever vegetables she could find. But Daniel ate it as though it were the finest meal he'd ever tasted. He broke the cornbread into small pieces, making each bite last. And Margaret found herself remembering all the meals she'd shared with Thomas at this same table, the way he'd always insisted she eat first, even when there wasn't enough for both of them. "Samuel." "Back to bed," Margaret said gently. "Can the soldier stay? It's dark outside, and Papa always said we should help people who need help." The innocent question hung in the air between them. Margaret looked at Daniel, who had paused with the spoon halfway to his mouth, clearly waiting for her decision. The sensible answer was no. She had already done more than enough, and keeping a strange man in her house overnight would violate every rule of wartime caution her neighbors had drummed into her. But looking at Daniel's gaunt face and the way he held his left side when he thought she wasn't watching, she found herself nodding. "He can sleep by the fire tonight, but you need to get your rest." After Samuel disappeared back into the bedroom, closing the door with exaggerated care to show he was being good, Margaret found blankets and made a rough bed on the floor near the hearth. The fire had burned down to coals, but there was still enough warmth to keep the worst of the night chill at bay. Daniel watched her work with the expression of someone who had forgotten that kindness without strings attached was possible. "Why are you helping me?" he asked finally. Margaret paused in her arranging of the blankets, considering the question. It was fair to ask, and one she'd been asking herself since she opened the door. The easy answer was Christian charity, the duty to help those in need that had been preached from every pulpit she'd ever sat in. But the real answer was more complicated, tied up in grief and loneliness, and the peculiar way that war had taught her to value life in all its forms. Because someone should, she said finally. Because if Thomas were wounded and lost somewhere, I'd want someone to show him the same kindness. Because we're all just trying to survive this thing, and maybe the only way we do that is by helping each other. Daniel nodded slowly, as though this made perfect sense to him. Your husband was lucky to have you. Margaret turned away to hide the sudden tears that threatened. Lucky seemed like the wrong word for a man who had died far from home, leaving behind a wife and child to face an uncertain future alone. But she understood what Daniel meant. In a world where kindness had become a luxury few could afford, perhaps having someone who remembered how to practice it was its own kind of fortune. Get some rest, she said. We'll see how you feel in the morning. That night, Margaret lay awake listening to Daniel's labored breathing from the kitchen and wondering what she had gotten herself into. She had heard stories of Confederate deserters who robbed and murdered the families who helped them, of Union soldiers who took advantage of Southern hospitality to gather intelligence for their armies. But she had also heard stories of ordinary people who had found ways to maintain their humanity in the midst of inhuman circumstances, and she wanted to believe that this was one of those times. The house creaked and settled around them, the familiar sounds of wood expanding and contracting with the temperature changes. Through the thin walls, she could hear Daniel shifting restlessly on his makeshift bed, sometimes muttering words she couldn't quite make out. Once she heard him cry out, a sound of pain or terror that made her half rise from her own bed before she heard him settle again. Samuel slept peacefully beside her, one small hand curled against his cheek, his breathing steady and deep. Looking at him in the dim light filtering through the window, Margaret was struck again by how much he resembled Thomas. The same dark hair, the same straight nose, the same stubborn chin, but there were differences too, subtle changes that spoke of the life he was living without his father, the ways that hardship and loss were shaping him into someone Thomas would recognize but might not have expected. When morning came, she found Daniel already awake, sitting up against the wall and staring out the window at the pale October sunrise. The color in his face was better, and when he moved to fold the blankets, his movements seemed less labored than they had the night before. Rest and food had worked their small miracle, giving his body just enough strength to begin the long process of healing. I should be going, he said, without looking at her. I've imposed on your kindness long enough. Margaret studied him critically. He was clearly improved, but he was far from healed, and she suspected that a day's walking would put him right back where he'd been when he arrived on her porch. More than that, she found herself reluctant to let him go. His presence had filled a space in her house that she hadn't realized was empty, not just the physical space, but the sense of purpose that came from caring for someone who needed her help. For 2 years, her life had been reduced to the basic necessities of survival, finding food, staying warm, keeping Samuel safe and healthy. It had been so long since she'd had the luxury of thinking beyond the immediate needs of each day that she'd almost forgotten what it felt like to have a larger purpose. Taking care of Daniel, watching him grow stronger, gave her something to focus on besides her own grief and uncertainty. Stay another day, she said impulsively. Let yourself heal properly. Daniel shook his head, but she could see the longing in his eyes, the part of him that wanted nothing more than to collapse back onto the blankets and sleep for a week. I can't ask you to do that. You've already done more than enough. You're not asking. I'm offering. They looked at each other across the small kitchen, and Margaret saw him wavering. Whatever was driving him south couldn't be urgent enough to risk his life on, and they both knew it. The war would still be there whether he rejoined his unit today or next week, but he might not be there to rejoin it if he pushed himself too hard too soon. One more day, he said finally, but I'll work for my keep. There must be something that needs fixing around here. There was, as it turned out, quite a lot that needed fixing. The war had taken away not just the men who might have done such work, but also the resources to hire it done. Margaret's small house had developed a dozen minor problems over the past year. A loose board on the front steps that rocked dangerously under any weight. A shutter that wouldn't close properly and let in both weather and unwanted attention. A leak in the roof that she had been trying to manage with strategically placed pots and buckets. Daniel worked with the careful precision of someone who had learned to make do with whatever tools and materials were available. He fashioned shims from scraps of wood to level the wobbly table, used wire salvaged from an old fence to repair the broken latch on the chicken coop, and somehow managed to stop the roof leak using nothing but tar paper and the kind of ingenuity that came from years of making something from nothing. Margaret watched him work and found herself remembering Thomas, who had possessed the same practical intelligence, the same ability to look at a problem and envision a solution using whatever was at hand. But where Thomas had been methodical and deliberate, Daniel worked with an urgency that spoke of someone who had learned not to count on having time to finish what he started. Samuel followed Daniel around like a devoted puppy, asking endless questions about everything from carpentry techniques to military life. Daniel answered patiently, but Margaret noticed that he steered the conversation away from battles and towards safer topics. The different kinds of wood and their uses, the proper way to sharpen a knife, the best methods for starting a fire in wet weather. "Were you a carpenter before the war?" Margaret asked as they sat down to a simple dinner of beans and the last of her preserved vegetables from the previous summer's garden. "My father was," Daniel said, cutting his portion of cornbread into precise squares. "I was supposed to take over his business, but then—" He gestured vaguely, encompassing the war and all the ways it had derailed everyone's plans. "What will you do after?" Daniel was quiet for so long that Margaret wondered if he had heard her question. When he finally spoke, his voice was distant, as though he were discussing someone else's life rather than his own future. "I don't know. Go home, I suppose, if there's anything left to go home to. Try to rebuild." "Where is home?" Lynchburg. Was Lynchburg, anyway. He looked down at his hands, calloused from work and scarred from fighting. "My wife died while I was away. Viva took her and our daughter both, winter before last. My neighbors wrote to tell me, but the letter took months to reach me, and by then it was too late to even attend the funeral." Margaret felt her heart clench with recognition and sympathy. She had thought her own loss was complete, but at least she had Samuel to anchor her to the world of the living, to give her a reason to get up each morning and face another day. Daniel had lost everything: family, home, purpose, future. No wonder he looked like a man walking through a landscape that no longer made sense to him. "I'm sorry," she said, knowing how inadequate the words were, but needing to offer them anyway. "It's the way of things now," Daniel replied, with the flat acceptance of someone who had run out of tears to shed. Everyone's lost someone. Everyone's lost something. The lucky ones just lost less than the rest of us. But that evening, after Samuel had gone to bed with promises to be extra quiet so the adults could talk, Margaret and Daniel sat by the fire and shared stories in the careful way of people who were learning to trust each other. Daniel told her about the months of marching and fighting, the way battles had begun to blur together into a single extended nightmare of mud and blood and noise. He spoke of friends who had died beside him, of orders that made no sense, and objectives that seemed to change with each passing week. Margaret told him about the challenges of managing alone, the way she had learned to stretch resources and make difficult decisions about what mattered most. She described the isolation of being one of the few women left in a community where most of the men were either dead or gone. The way neighbors had become suspicious of each other as resources grew scarce and desperation made everyone a potential threat. "Thomas always said I was stronger than I thought," she said, staring into the flames that danced in the fireplace. "I used to think he was just being kind, trying to make me feel better about myself, but now, I suppose, we don't know what we're capable of until we have to find out." "He was right," Daniel said, and there was something in his voice that made her look at him sharply. "What you're doing, raising a child alone, keeping this place together, helping a stranger who could be dangerous for all you know. It takes a special kind of strength." Margaret felt herself flush with something that might have been pride or pleasure. It had been so long since anyone had acknowledged the difficulty of her daily existence, let alone praised her for managing it, that she had almost forgotten how good such recognition could feel. The next morning brought rain, a steady downpour that turned the roads to mud and made travel impossible for anyone on foot. Daniel looked out at the weather with obvious frustration, watching the water stream off the roof and pool in the yard. But Margaret felt a secret relief. Another day of his presence, another day of having someone to cook for and worry about, another day of feeling useful in ways that went beyond mere survival. They spent the morning working together to winterize her small house, banking earth around the foundation to keep out drafts, checking the chimney for loose stones that might fall and cause a fire, securing anything that might be vulnerable to winter storms. Daniel worked with an intensity that spoke of someone who understood the importance of preparation, who had learned the hard way what happened when you were caught unprepared by circumstances beyond your control. Margaret found herself studying him as they worked, noticing details she had missed in the urgency of the previous days. He was younger than she had first thought, probably not much older than Thomas had been when they married. But the war had aged him in ways that went beyond the premature grey in his hair or the lines around his eyes. There was a wariness in the way he moved, a constant awareness of his surroundings that spoke of someone who had learned to expect danger from any direction. In the afternoon, while Samuel napped and the rain continued to fall in steady sheets outside, Margaret found herself mending one of Daniel's shirts. She had offered to wash his few belongings while he stayed, and the shirt had come back from the clothesline with several tears that needed attention. The fabric was worn thin in places and stained beyond redemption, but the tears could be patched, and she had discovered that she enjoyed the simple rhythm of the needle moving through cloth. Daniel sat at her table, carving a small wooden soldier for Samuel with infinite patience and care. He had found a piece of good hardwood in Thomas's small collection of materials, and his hands moved with the practiced confidence of someone who had spent years working with tools. The figure was taking shape slowly, a soldier in uniform, with careful attention to details like buttons and belt buckles. "You don't have to do that," Daniel said, watching her work on his shirt. "I want to," Margaret replied, and realized it was true. There was something satisfying about this small act of care, this tangible way of helping someone who had helped her. It reminded her of the early days of her marriage to Thomas, when taking care of him had felt like a privilege rather than an obligation. "Your husband," Daniel said carefully, not looking up from his carving. "What was he like?" Margaret considered the question, pausing in her stitching to think about how to capture Thomas in words. It had been months since anyone had asked her about Thomas as a person, rather than simply acknowledging his death with awkward condolences. She found that she wanted to talk about him, to make him real again through the sharing of memories. "He was steady," she said finally, resuming her careful stitches. "The kind of man who thought things through before he acted, who kept his promises no matter what it cost him. He could be stubborn sometimes. Once he made up his mind about something, it was almost impossible to change it. But he was gentle too, especially with Samuel. He had so much patience for teaching, for explaining how things worked and why they mattered. He sounds like a good man." "He was." Margaret paused in her sewing, looking out the window at the rain-soaked landscape. "He didn't want to go to war, you know. He said it was rich men's politics being fought with poor men's blood. But when Virginia seceded, he felt like he didn't have a choice. He said a man had to stand with his neighbors, even when he wasn't sure they were right. Daniel's hand stilled on the wooden figure, and Margaret saw something cross his face, a flicker of recognition, perhaps, or memory. That's exactly what he said. Margaret looked up sharply from her mending. What? Daniel set down his knife and looked at her directly for the first time since he'd begun the story. There was something in his expression, guilt, knowledge, a weight of unspoken words that made her heart begin to race. I knew your husband, Mrs. Whitmore. We served together for almost 2 years. The shirt fell from Margaret's hands as though she had been struck. You knew Thomas. We were in the same company, fought in the same battles, shared the same campfires, talked about the same things that all soldiers talk about: home, family, what we'd do when the war was over. Daniel's voice was steady, but she could see the effort it cost him to maintain that steadiness. I was with him when he died. The world seemed to tilt around Margaret, and she gripped the edge of the table to steady herself. Her mind raced to process this revelation, to understand what it meant that the man she had been caring for, the stranger she had invited into her home, had been there at the end of Thomas's life, had perhaps been one of the last people to see her husband alive, to hear his voice, to witness his final moments. Tell me, she whispered, barely able to get the words out. Daniel looked down at his hands, and when he spoke, his voice was barely audible above the sound of rain on the roof. It was at Gettysburg, the second day of fighting. We were advancing up a hill. Cemetery Ridge, they called it later, though we didn't know the name at the time. The Yankees had artillery positioned at the top, and they were cutting us down as we climbed. Men were falling all around us, but we kept going because those were our orders. Margaret felt the room spinning around her, but she forced herself to listen, to hear the truth she had been trying to imagine for months. Thomas was maybe 10 feet ahead of me when the shell hit. It was one of those big artillery rounds. You could hear it coming, screaming through the air like a banshee. Most of us hit the ground, but Thomas... Daniel's voice broke slightly. Thomas saw a young boy from our company, barely 16 years old, frozen with fear right in the path of that shell. Without thinking, Thomas threw himself forward and knocked the boy out of the way. Margaret's hand flew to her mouth, tears streaming down her face as she pictured the scene. Thomas, always thinking of others before himself, making the choice to save someone else's child even as death came for him. The shell took him instead, Daniel continued, his own eyes bright with unshed tears. It was quick, ma'am. He wouldn't have suffered, but that boy lived because of what your husband did. He made it through the war and went home to his family in North Carolina. Margaret nodded through her tears, unable to speak. It was exactly the kind of thing Thomas would have done, sacrificing himself for someone younger, someone who hadn't yet had the chance to live a full life. She had always known her husband was brave, but hearing about his final act of courage from someone who had witnessed it gave her a different kind of comfort than all the official condolences and formal letters she had received. But that's not the only reason I came here, Daniel continued, his voice growing stronger. There's something else, something I should have told you sooner, but I didn't know how. Margaret wiped her eyes and looked at him expectantly. There was something in his expression, guilt, determination, fear, that made her stomach clench with anticipation. Daniel reached into his jacket and withdrew a folded piece of paper, worn soft from handling. The edges were frayed, and the creases were deep, as though it had been folded and unfolded countless times. He asked me to give this to you. His last words were about you and Samuel. He made me promise to find you, no matter how long it took. Margaret stared at the paper as though it were a snake that might strike her. Another letter from Thomas, one she had never seen, words he had written knowing he might die. The thought was both wonderful and terrifying, to have new words from her dead husband, to hear his voice again across the divide of death. I tried to find you right after the battle, Daniel said, his words coming faster now, as though he needed to get them all out before he lost his nerve. But everything was chaos after Gettysburg. The army was retreating, wounded men were scattered everywhere, and I got separated from what was left of our regiment. Then I was wounded myself in a skirmish near the Potomac, and by the time I recovered enough to travel, months had passed. He paused, swallowing hard before continuing. I've been carrying this letter ever since, trying to find a way to get it to you. I asked in every town I passed through, followed every lead, tracked down anyone who might have known Thomas or known where his family lived. It took me almost a year to find Millbrook, and when I got here, I was told you lived in this house at the edge of town. Margaret's hands shook as she reached for the letter. The paper felt fragile between her fingers, as though it might crumble at her touch. Thomas's name was written on the outside in his own careful handwriting, along with instructions for delivery that made her heart ache. For my beloved wife Margaret, if I should not return home. Go ahead, Daniel said gently. Read it. With trembling hands, Margaret unfolded the paper and saw Thomas's handwriting looking back at her, but different from the careful script of his other letters. Hastier, more urgent, written by someone who knew time was running out. My dearest Margaret, she read aloud, her voice breaking with emotion. If you are reading this, then Private Hayes has kept his promise, and I am grateful to him for that kindness. I write this as we prepare for what may be our final battle, and I need you to know that every step I have taken away from you and Samuel has been the hardest thing I have ever done. Margaret paused, wiping away tears that made the words blur on the page. Daniel sat silently across from her, his own face etched with grief and something that might have been relief at finally being able to fulfill his promise. I did not leave because I wanted to, she continued reading, but because I believed it was my duty to protect the life we built together, even if that meant I might not live to enjoy it. I know you will blame yourself for not stopping me, will think that you should have found the words to make me stay. But please know that nothing you could have said would have changed my mind, because my love for you and Samuel is exactly what made leaving necessary. Margaret had to stop again, overwhelmed by the familiar sound of Thomas's voice in his written words, by the way he had known exactly what she would think and feel after his death. You are stronger than you know, the letter continued, braver than you believe, and more capable than you have ever given yourself credit for. I've seen you face childbirth and illness and hardship with a courage that humbles me. I know that you will find a way to survive whatever comes after I am gone. And more than that, I know you will find a way to help Samuel become the kind of man we both want him to be. The next paragraph made Margaret's breath catch in her throat. Take care of our son. But do not forget to take care of yourself as well. When this war is over and you have had time to grieve, I want you to find happiness again. Find someone who will love you as you deserve to be loved, who will be a father to Samuel and a partner to you in building whatever comes next. I would never want my death to be the end of your joy or the reason you close your heart to future love. Margaret looked up at Daniel through her tears, seeing him with new eyes. Had Thomas somehow known that Daniel would be the one to bring her this letter? Had he sensed something in his fellow soldier that made him trust him, not just with the delivery of his final words, but with the care of his family? There's more, Daniel said quietly, and Margaret returned to the letter. To Private Hayes, who has promised to carry this letter to my wife. I do not know if you will survive this war any more than I know if I will, but if you are reading these words along with Margaret, then you have kept faith with a dying man's request. I saw the way you looked when you spoke of your own losses, and I recognize a kindred spirit, a man who understands the value of what we are fighting to protect. If fate has brought you to my family's door, then perhaps it is because they need the kind of help and protection that only someone who has lost everything can truly provide. I would be honored if you chose to help them rebuild whatever this war has destroyed. Margaret's hands shook as she read the final lines. All my love to my dear wife and son. May God grant that this letter finds you safe, and may He provide for your needs when I no longer can. Your devoted husband, Thomas. The letter fell from Margaret's fingers as she was overcome with emotion. Daniel reached across the table and gently took her hand, offering what comfort he could while she wept for her husband's loss and marveled at his final gift to her, not just the letter itself, but the man who had brought it to her. When she could finally speak, Margaret looked into Daniel's eyes and saw the weight he had been carrying, the burden of this promise that had driven him across a war-torn countryside to find her. "Is that why you came here?" she asked. "Just to deliver the letter?" Daniel hesitated, clearly wrestling with how much truth to reveal. "At first, yes. It was the last promise I made to a good man, and I couldn't rest until I'd kept it. But then he looked around the small kitchen, taking in the signs of her struggle and her strength, the way she had created a home for herself and Samuel despite everything the war had taken from them. I hadn't expected to find someone who would show such generosity to a stranger. I hadn't expected to feel like maybe there was still some goodness left in the world. What? Like maybe I wasn't too broken to deserve it," he finished quietly. Margaret set the letter carefully on the table and really looked at Daniel, not as a wounded soldier or a bearer of messages from the dead, but as a man who had lost everything and was trying to figure out how to keep living anyway. She saw in his face the same uncertainty that she carried, the same question about whether it was possible to build something new from the wreckage of everything you had once taken for granted. But she also saw strength there and kindness, and the kind of steady reliability that Thomas had possessed. Daniel had spent months searching for her, had risked his life repeatedly to keep a promise to a dead man. He had worked tirelessly to repair her house, had been patient and gentle with Samuel, had shown her a respect and consideration that made her feel valued as a person rather than simply endured as a burden. "What will you do now?" she asked. "I don't know," Daniel admitted, and she could hear the uncertainty in his voice. "I suppose I'll go back to Lynchburg, see what's left of my old life. Try to rebuild, like everyone else is trying to rebuild." Margaret thought about the letter, about Thomas's words urging her to find happiness again when she was ready. She thought about the past few days, the way Daniel's presence had changed the rhythm of her life, had made her feel like a woman rather than just a survivor. She thought about Samuel, who had attached himself to Daniel with the desperate affection of a child, hungry for male guidance and attention. More than that, she thought about the loneliness that had been her constant companion for the past year, the way she had learned to fill her days with work and worry to avoid thinking too much about the empty years stretching ahead of her. Daniel's presence had reminded her what it felt like to have a partner, someone to share the burden of daily decisions and the comfort of evening conversations. "Or," she said carefully, testing the words as she spoke them, "you could stay." Daniel blinked at her in surprise. "What?" "Stay here, in Millbrook. There's work for a carpenter. Half the houses in town need repairs, and most of the men who might do such work are dead or gone. Samuel needs—" She paused, searching for the right words to express something she had only just begun to understand herself. Samuel needs someone who can teach him the things his father would have taught him. And I— What? Margaret took a deep breath, feeling as though she was stepping off a cliff into unknown territory. "I could use a partner, someone to help with the work, to share the burden of rebuilding. It doesn't have to be anything more than that. Not at first. But maybe, in time." Daniel stared at her for a long moment, and Margaret held her breath, suddenly terrified that she had misread the situation entirely, that her offer would be met with rejection or worse, pity. She had revealed too much, had shown him the depth of her loneliness and need, and now he would have to find a polite way to decline. "You barely know me," Daniel said finally, but his voice was gentle rather than dismissive. "I know enough," Margaret replied, surprising herself with her certainty. "I know you're kind to children and patient with questions. I know you work hard and keep your promises, even when they're difficult to keep. I know you've lost everything and are still trying to find ways to help other people." She reached across the table and touched his hand lightly. "I know that Thomas trusted you with his final words and his family's future, and that's recommendation enough for me." Daniel looked down at their joined hands, then back at her face, and she could see him weighing her offer against whatever plans he had made for his own future. What about the neighbors? What will people say about a Confederate soldier living in the house of a Confederate widow whose husband died in the same war? Margaret realized she had misspoken earlier and felt a moment of confusion, but then understanding dawned. Thomas fought for the Confederacy too, remember? And besides, the war is ending, even if the politicians haven't admitted it yet. Soon enough, we'll all just be Americans again, trying to figure out how to live together. And Samuel. Samuel adores you already. He's been asking me every morning when you're going to come back from wherever you went, as if you were just running errands instead of planning to leave forever. Daniel was quiet for so long that Margaret began to worry she had pushed too hard, had asked for more than he was prepared to give. She was about to withdraw her offer when he squeezed her hand gently. "I'd like to stay," he said. "I'd like to try to build something good out of all this destruction." Margaret felt something loosen in her chest, a knot of loneliness and fear that she had carried for so long she had forgotten it was there. "Good," she said simply. That evening, they told Samuel together, sitting him down at the kitchen table where they had shared so many meals over the past few days. The boy's reaction was everything Margaret had hoped for. Pure joy, followed immediately by a dozen plans for things they could build and places they could explore together. "Will you be my new papa?" Samuel asked with the directness that only children possessed. Daniel looked at Margaret, seeking guidance on how to answer such a loaded question. She nodded encouragingly, trusting him to find the right words. "I'll never try to replace your real papa," Daniel said carefully. "He was a hero, and he loved you very much. But I'd be honored to help take care of you and your mama, and to teach you the things a boy needs to know as he grows up." Samuel considered this for a moment, then nodded solemnly. "Mama says Papa is in heaven now, so he probably wants someone to help us while he's gone." The simple faith in the child's words brought tears to both adults' eyes, but they were tears of hope rather than sorrow. Later, after Samuel had finally exhausted himself with excitement and gone to bed, Margaret and Daniel sat by the fire and talked about practical matters, how to make the arrangement work, what the neighbors might say, how to navigate the complicated emotions that would inevitably arise as they tried to build something new from the ashes of their old lives. "I won't pretend this will be easy," Margaret said, watching the flames dance in the fireplace. "We're both carrying a lot of grief, a lot of uncertainty about the future. There will be difficult days when we remember what we've lost and wonder if we're doing the right thing." "I know," Daniel replied, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what they were contemplating. "But I've had enough of being alone with my ghosts. Maybe it's time to try living with hope instead of just surviving with memories." Margaret nodded, thinking of Thomas's letter and his blessing on whatever happiness she might find. The future was still uncertain. The war might drag on for months or years. The economy might never recover from the devastation that had swept across the South. Their tentative partnership might not survive the pressures that were sure to come. But for the first time since Thomas's death, Margaret felt like she had something to look forward to, something to build toward, rather than simply endure. Outside, the October wind continued to rattle the windows, carrying with it the scent of coming winter and the promise of harder times ahead. But inside Margaret's small house, three people who had found each other against all odds sat warm by the fire, planning for tomorrow and the days that would follow. learning to believe that survival might not be the only thing worth fighting for. As the weeks passed, and autumn deepened into the first bite of winter, Daniel proved to be everything Margaret had hoped for and more. He was patient with Samuel's endless questions, answering each one with the careful attention of someone who understood how hungry children were for knowledge and guidance. He was respectful of Margaret's independence, asking for her opinions on decisions large and small, never presuming to take over responsibilities she had managed alone for so long. Most importantly, he was careful to honor Thomas's memory, even as he helped create new traditions and routines for their unconventional family. When Samuel asked to hear stories about his father, Daniel would add his own memories to Margaret's, painting a picture of Thomas as both the heroic figure the boy needed him to be and the flawed human man he had actually been. The neighbors accepted Daniel's presence gradually, won over by his skill with repairs and his willingness to help anyone who needed it. Mrs. Patterson, the elderly widow who lived closest to Margaret's house, had been initially suspicious of the arrangement, but her attitude changed completely after Daniel spent 2 days fixing her roof without being asked and refused to accept any payment beyond a jar of her famous apple butter. That man has the hands of a craftsman and the heart of a Christian, she told Margaret one afternoon as they worked together to preserve the last of the autumn vegetables. Your Thomas would approve, I think. The comment stayed with Margaret as she watched Daniel teach Samuel how to whittle a whistle from a piece of willow, his large hands guiding her son's smaller ones with infinite patience. Would Thomas approve? She thought he would, especially if he could see how Samuel had begun to smile again, how the boys' laughter had returned to fill the quiet spaces of their home. Winter came early that year, bringing with it the kind of bone-deep cold that made every task twice as difficult. But Margaret found that the season was more bearable with Daniel there to share the burden. He rose before dawn to tend the fire and check on the animals, his quiet movements allowing her to sleep a precious hour longer. He spent long evenings by lamplight, teaching Samuel his letters and numbers while Margaret mended clothes or worked on the endless tasks that kept a household running. On the coldest nights, when the wind howled around the house and snow piled against the windows, the three of them would sit together in the kitchen, the warmest room in the house, and Daniel would tell stories of his childhood in Lynchburg or his father's carpentry shop. His voice was low and soothing, and Margaret found herself looking forward to these evenings almost as much as Samuel did. It was during one of these storytelling sessions that Samuel asked the question Margaret had been dreading. "Why don't you and Mama get married like other mamas and papas?" Daniel's hands stilled on the piece of wood he was carving, and Margaret felt her cheeks flush with embarrassment. They had been living as a family in all but name for months now, but the question of marriage had remained unspoken between them, a possibility that hovered at the edges of their conversations without ever being directly addressed. "Marriage is something that grown-ups have to think about very carefully," Margaret said, trying to buy time to formulate a better answer. "It's not just about living in the same house or caring about each other. It's about making promises that last forever." But you do care about each other," Samuel observed, with the clear-eyed logic of childhood. "I can tell." Margaret looked at Daniel and saw her own uncertainty reflected in his eyes. They did care about each other. That much was undeniable. Over the months of shared meals and daily routines, of working together to solve problems and comfort each other through difficult moments, something deeper than friendship had developed between them. But was it love? And if it was, what did that mean for their future together? "Your mama's right that marriage is something that requires a lot of thought," Daniel said carefully. "But Samuel, you should know that whether we get married or not, I'm not going anywhere. This is my home now, and you and your mama are my family." It was the closest either of them had come to declaring their feelings, and Margaret felt a warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the fire crackling in the hearth. That night, After Samuel had gone to bed, she and Daniel sat together longer than usual, each seemingly waiting for the other to broach the subject that had been raised. "He's not wrong, you know," Daniel said finally, "about us caring for each other." "I know," Margaret replied softly. "I've been thinking the same thing. But," Margaret sighed, trying to put her complicated feelings into words, "I loved Thomas with everything I had. For a long time after he died, I couldn't imagine ever feeling that way about anyone else. I thought my heart was too damaged, too full of grief to make room for new love. And now? Now I'm not sure what I feel is the same as what I felt for Thomas. But that doesn't mean it's less than what I felt for him. It's different, quieter maybe, built on different foundations, but it's real." Daniel reached over and took her hand, his calloused fingers intertwining with hers. "I know what you mean. What I had with my wife it was like a bright flame, intense and consuming. What I feel for you is more like steady coals, warmer, more sustainable, maybe more suited to the long work of building a life together." Margaret squeezed his hand, grateful for his understanding. "Thomas told me in his letter to find happiness again when I was ready. I think I'm ready now, or at least ready to try." "So what do we do?" Margaret considered the question, thinking about all the practical and emotional considerations that would go into such a decision. "We could post the banns at the church, have Reverend Mills marry us in the spring when the weather's better for traveling. Give people time to get used to the idea. Let Samuel adjust to thinking of us as husband and wife, rather than just whatever we are now." Daniel smiled, the first truly joyful expression she had seen on his face since the day he'd arrived on her doorstep. "I'd like that. I'd like it very much." They were married on a warm day in May 1864, in the small church where Margaret had worshipped all her life. The ceremony was simple, but heartfelt, attended by most of the remaining residents of Millbrook and several families from neighboring towns who had heard about the unusual romance between the widow and the soldier who had brought her husband's last letter. Samuel served as ring-bearer, carrying the simple gold band that Daniel had crafted himself from a piece of jewelry that had belonged to his mother. Margaret wore her best dress, carefully altered to fit her properly after months of better nutrition, and carried a bouquet of wildflowers that Samuel had picked for her that morning. As they exchanged vows, Margaret found herself thinking not of Thomas, but of the future she and Daniel were promising to build together. There would be children, she hoped, brothers and sisters for Samuel, new life to fill their home with laughter and chaos. There would be challenges too, times when their different experiences and expectations would clash, moments when grief for their lost spouses would threaten to overshadow their present happiness. But as she looked into Daniel's eyes and promised to love and honor him for the rest of her days, Margaret felt confident that they had built something strong enough to weather whatever storms might come. They had been tested by loss and hardship, had chosen each other not out of desperation or convenience, but out of genuine affection and respect. The war officially ended 3 weeks after their wedding, with news arriving by horseback that Lee had surrendered and the Confederate armies were laying down their arms across the South. The news was met with mixed emotions in Millbrook: relief that the killing was finally over, uncertainty about what peace would bring, grief for all the young men who would never come home to see the world they had died fighting for. That evening, as the three of them sat on their front porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and pink, Samuel asked the question that was on everyone's mind. What happens now? Margaret looked at Daniel, seeing in his face the same mixture of hope and uncertainty that she felt. The peace they had all longed for had finally come, but it brought with it the daunting task of rebuilding not just their communities, but their entire way of life. "Now we rebuild," Daniel said simply. "We help our neighbors put their lives back together. We raise our children to be better than we were, and we try to make sure that something like this war never happens again." Will more soldiers come through town? Some will, Margaret said, thinking of all the men who would be walking home from distant battlefields, many of them carrying wounds that would never fully heal. And when they do, we'll help them however we can. Everyone deserves a chance to start over. It was a promise that would define the rest of their lives together. In the years that followed, their home became known as a place where veterans could find a meal and a bed, where families torn apart by war could reconnect, where the slow work of healing could begin. Daniel's carpentry business grew as communities across Virginia struggled to rebuild, and Margaret became known throughout the county for her skill as a midwife and herbalist, helping to bring new life into a world that had seen too much death. Samuel grew up strong and thoughtful, shaped by the stories of his father's courage and his stepfather's quiet dedication to helping others. He would eventually become a teacher, dedicated to educating the children who would inherit the world his parents had worked so hard to rebuild. Margaret and Daniel had 3 more children together, twin daughters born in 1866 and a son born in 1869, who inherited his father's skill with tools and his mother's gift for healing. Each child was told the story of how their parents had met, how a hungry soldier's knock on a widow's door had changed all their lives forever. On quiet evenings, when the children were asleep and the work of the day was done, Margaret and Daniel would sit together on their porch and remember the night that had brought them together. Sometimes Margaret would take out Thomas's letter, now carefully preserved between pages of the family Bible, and read his words about finding happiness and building a new life from the ashes of the old. "Do you think he would be proud of what we've built?" she asked Daniel on one such evening, 20 years after that first desperate knock on her door. Daniel considered the question, looking out over the thriving farm they had created together, the garden where their children played, the workshop where he taught young men the skills they would need to support families of their own. "I think," he said finally, "that Thomas would be amazed by what you've accomplished, not just with me and our family, but with everything. The way you've helped other people find their footing after the war, the lives you've saved as a midwife, the kindness you've shown to strangers who needed help." Margaret leaned against his shoulder, feeling the contentment that came from a life well lived. "We've been blessed," she said simply. "We have," Daniel agreed, "but I think we've also made our own blessings by choosing to help each other instead of letting grief and loss make us bitter." As the years passed and their children grew up and started families of their own, Margaret often reflected on the strange chain of events that had brought Daniel into her life. If Thomas hadn't died at Gettysburg, if Daniel hadn't made that promise to a dying man, if she hadn't opened her door to a hungry stranger on that October night, any one of those moments could have changed everything. But perhaps, she thought, that was the nature of love itself. It rarely came in the form you expected, rarely followed the path you had planned for it. Sometimes it arrived disguised as tragedy, sometimes as a knock on the door from someone you had never met, but who would change your life forever. Margaret lived to be 83 years old, long enough to see her grandchildren grow up and start families of their own. On her deathbed, surrounded by the large and loving family she and Daniel had created together, she spoke her final words to her husband of nearly 40 years. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible but her meaning clear to everyone in the room, "for keeping your promise, for bringing Thomas's letter, for staying, for everything." Daniel held her hand as she slipped away, tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. After the funeral, when the last mourners had gone home and the house felt empty without her presence, he sat alone in their kitchen and opened the family Bible to read Thomas's letter one more time. The paper was yellow with age now, the ink faded but still legible, the words as powerful as they had been on the day Margaret first read them aloud in that same kitchen 40 years earlier. Daniel had kept his promise to a dying man, had helped the man's widow find happiness again, had been part of raising the man's son to become a good and productive citizen. More than that, he had found his own second chance at love, had built a life that honored both the past and the future, had learned that healing was possible even after the deepest wounds. It was, he thought, exactly what Thomas had hoped for when he penned those final words on a battlefield far from home. The story of Margaret and Daniel Hayes became part of Millbrook's local history, passed down through generations as an example of how love could triumph over loss, how strangers could become family, how the worst tragedies could sometimes lead to the greatest blessings. Their descendants still lived in the area, still told the story of the widow who fed a hungry soldier and the soldier who brought her the gift of her husband's final words. In the end, it was a story about the resilience of the human heart, about the power of compassion to transform lives, about the way that kindness shown to strangers could create ripples that lasted for generations. It was a reminder that in times of great darkness, sometimes the greatest acts of courage were the smallest acts of love. Opening a door, sharing a meal, choosing to trust when trust seemed impossible. Margaret Whitmore Hayes had learned that lesson on a cold October night in 1863, when a hungry soldier's knock on her door changed not just her own life, but the lives of countless others who would benefit from the love and compassion that grew from that single moment of grace. It was a lesson that would echo through the generations, a testament to the enduring power of human kindness in a world that often seemed determined to prove that such kindness was impossible.